Okay guys, so in this video we are going to talk a little bit about a tricky subject that you will most likely face if you have a international product. So let's get into it. Now, we will cover a few concepts and I will try to explain to you to the best of my capacity basically as to what the challenges are going to be if you have a product that is going to provide an experience to multiple different types of customers or multiple countries, that sort of thing. So basically the challenges that you will face is that unless you have a product that is going to behave and act and be the exact same for every situation, this is the sort of situation you will face. You will have different pages or different components and things of that nature that need to be a little bit different. And the issue is that when you get all these inconsistencies, it gets very tricky for you to maintain that for multiple projects. I mean, it's you can imagine it yourself. What happens if you have one code base and maybe you have two different customers, and in one scenario the customer A wants certain things and customer B wants certain things, but they still have things that are very common and they only differ on the small details and so forth and so forth. Like that gets really tricky very quickly, and this is where in this little video of mine I'll show you an example of how this can be mitigated. So we're going to cover what we need to consider when we have an app for many customers, and we are going to talk about what happens when a customer asks for custom features, and then we will talk a little bit about how we can separate features from our customers. So let's get into the notes here. When dealing with international applications or applications that will be a little bit different for each customer, it is vital that you have a good strategy for feature toggling. Now, feature toggling is the idea that if as mentioned earlier, if customer A wants feature 1, 2, and 3, but customer B only wants feature 1, you need to have a way to express in your code that all right, if customer A is using the application, certain things are going to be shown to that customer, or functionality is going to be provided to that customer, but customer B does not have all of those features, right? So the most common way this is done is by using if conditions in the code to toggle different components on and off at runtime. What basically that means is that let's say that you have a React component, let's say that you have a header or a piece of text or a modal or something like that. And then you will simply state in your code that okay, if you are running in an environment that is designed to be catering to, say, England or like an English market, then you show this component. But if you're in the Swedish market, you show another component. That's extremely common, and it's the very what I call like the boilerplate naive type of thing that people will do in order to support feature toggling. So the issue with this is that it gets very messy when you have a lot of customers components, because imagine like if you have two customers that have different requirements for their components, that's kind of easy. But if you have 3, 4, 5, 6, maybe 15 different customers, you can imagine how many if statements and complexity that brings with it. And let's not even talk about testing, because good God, imagine that every single time you make a single change to a component, you have to go to every single customer's environment and make sure that you didn't break something for them because you changed something for another customer. So basically, the tricky part here is to find a way to separate all of this functionality so that one customer doesn't have all the unnecessary stuff that another customer wants. Like if you're on the server, this is not as much of a problem. You can, in theory, have the same code living all in the same code base without much of an issue. But in front end, and like when you're doing JavaScript or React in this scenario, it gets a little bit trickier, because the problem is that if you have, let's say you have a large amount of customers, you don't want to send a bunch of code that, like you don't want to send all the code for every customer to each customer. You want to only send the stuff that is relevant to that customer, because load times and stuff of that nature, right? So what I'm going to show you in this video is basically how you can achieve that, a take on this. And the code that I'm going to show you now is not like something that, like this exact implementation, I have not used myself in production, but I have used many varying degrees of this approach, and the current company I'm working for is very strongly considering to use this approach, and it's most likely going to be in the next release of our application, basically. So let's just start by looking through the code, right? So we have this little server here, we import the application, we listen on port 3000, so let's go to the source. Here we have our index HTML, like it's just a basic Express server that serves out two different endpoints, one for the English market and one for the Swedish market. Let's look at the views just to give you a brief introduction here. So we have a root element, and then we have a JavaScript file that is for the English market, and we have the exact same thing for the Swedish market, and it's just a Swedish bundle, if you will. So that's the basic structure, and we'll walk through this in just a moment. So let's talk about the configuration first and foremost. So this is a dist folder. This is where all our generated code is, right? And we're going to talk about that in just a moment as well. So the idea that we're going for here is that we need a way to be able to have a code base that allows us to sometimes use the same component for all our customers, and sometimes we need to have a custom component that is a little bit different for one customer. That's what we're going for here. And sometimes we have to have a component that is going to be in our for like one customer, it's going to exist for one customer, but for another customer it's not going to be there. So we need to have that flexibility to import and like change things in that manner, right? So the way that you can I argue that this makes the most sense to do this is at build time. Now what do I mean by build time? Well, I mean that instead of having a bunch of if and else conditions in your code when the code is running on the in your customer's browser, you create different bundles, or you create multiple applications that simply include exactly what one customer needs, but at the same time you only have a single code base. So if you look at this application component here, so I have two versions here, but like I'll just show you in a moment why that is. But the basic idea is that you have one code base that internally knows that, okay, so this is a component that is always going to be the same, and sometimes it's going to be one or the other depending on your use case, right? So how you achieve this is in my opinion fairly simple, I would say. Like it's more complicated than if you have an application that works the exact same way for every customer, but I found that this is the closest thing to a nice implementation of this that I can find. So the way that I approach this is that I create a little environments array that contains the different environments that I need to build my applications for. And then I use Webpack to kind of iterate through all of those, and then I simply create one bundle for each market. In this scenario it's just per country or per like language, but it could work for, of course, any type of scenario where you have multiple customers or multiple environments. So we build it using this little plugin here. So we use the define plugin, and then we define an environmental variable that is going to exist in the code that is called language, so that we can in our code know which language we are currently building our application for. This will be important in just a moment. So this is for production, like when we've created all our features and we want to produce the production code, right? But if for development purposes we'll do something much simpler. Let's say that we default to always using the English markets, and then we just have a very similar file though where we just build for a single environment instead, which makes it much easier for development purposes, because you don't want to generate all the different variations of the application every time you make a small update when you're just trying things out, right? Okay, so now let's have a small look at our app here. So here's our app. All it is it's a header, and it's a subheading and some type of paragraph, and then we are using lazy loading basically which is if you don't know what lazy loading lazy loading is, have a look at the Webpack documentation. That's a separate video, but basically the idea here is that you bundle together your dependencies into a separate bundle that you can load in through Webpack. That's what's happening here with these two files here. So React and React DOM are created in these bundles, so that the browser can cache them separately, so we don't have to refetch them every time we make an update to our code, right? So here's our little simple application. It has a header, a subheading, and a paragraph. So these comments will make sense in just a moment. I just want to show you the basic application. So here we have our application. So we have something for the English market, and then we have this little subheading here. And if I go to the Swedish endpoint we saw earlier, we only have the Swedish header. And as we saw in the index.html file earlier, or rather the HTML files earlier, we have two different builds, and I will walk you through exactly how all of this works. So let's look at the header first and foremost. So the header is a component that is going to be common for each application, but it's going to be slightly different. We need different variations for the Swedish market and for the English market. And so the way that I achieve this is by doing this. So in Node.js, or the way that we structure Node, is that there's this convention called an index.js file, which means that this is the entry point to our header directory. So when we include the header, we're actually getting to this file first. So what we're doing here is that we are declaring a component, just a function that, because in React, if you didn't know that, everything is a function. So you declare a function here that returns null, which means that if you return null in a function in React basically, that means that this is simply not going to render something to the DOM. But what's happening here is that we now have an if-else condition where we are checking if we are in the Swedish language environment, then we use a require to overwrite this null component with whatever is specified for the Swedish market. Otherwise, we will simply use the English version. Now, we could have done something similar, like something differently, and you'll see that in just a moment, but I just want you to grab this idea. So when we require this component at build time, Webpack is going to grab the correct version of this component and only include the thing that is correct for that bundle. That's what's happening here. That's why you're seeing this difference in EN and SV. I'll show you exactly how it works. It's a very trivial little application component. This is all it is. So the Swedish version of this component just has SV, and the English version has EN. Now this is a trivial example, but this is very powerful because this means that you could literally create multiple versions of the same component and simply express here in your index.js file which version you want to load depending on situation. Now, you don't have to do this. This is only if you have customers who need different functionality depending on, maybe they have a component that is sort of the same, but it's going to behave a little bit different depending on situation. So this is like a exception to the rule. But if you, let's say that you have this paragraph component, well, this paragraph component doesn't have any conditions, and it doesn't care about the language that you're using because it's going to be the exact same for every application. And then you have the other scenario we saw earlier, that if you see that this is only for EN, this component, this subheading component, which is this thing here, right? This thing, it's really only used in one environment. So let's look at that file. Okay, so we have this component that returns a null, and if we're in the English market, we will require the English version of this component. Otherwise, we will simply return a component that is going to render to null, which means that this component here is sometimes going to be there, and or rather, for the English market, it's going to be there. For all other markets, it's not going to be there. And that could be, I'll touch on that in just a moment, because I can get you, that's a little bit of a concern, because if you have something that says in the code that it's going to be there, and sometimes it's going to be there, and sometimes it's not going to be there, that can be a little bit confusing. But I will touch on that in just a moment. So what you're seeing here is that we're simply grabbing the component if we're in the English market. So here we are. This is our entire component. So what we can trust now is that when we're building for the Swedish market, that component is not going to be there. It's just going to be empty, as we saw earlier. And the reason why we want to do this as build time is because the bundle that we are creating is now only going to include the things that are specific to the market. So I have two bundles here. If I go to the Swedish bundle here and I search for SV, you see that I find this compiled React element here, the H1. But if I try to find the EN, it's nowhere to be found, because everything that is specific to the English market is found in the English bundle. So this is, like, if I do, let's see here, this is only, yeah. So you can see that this is only for EN. That component is also there, but in the Swedish version, if we go back, this is, yeah, we can't find it because it's not included in the bundle. And that's what's so powerful about this. Instead of having an if-else condition that is happening inside of the runtime, like instead of having one big massive bundle, we can actually create multiple bundles that simply contain the things that we need at for that environment, right? So how can we then improve this like one step further? Because as you can imagine, there's a little bit of a concern here. I actually got a coworker of mine asked about this thing because he didn't really like the idea that, oh, right, but this subheading thing here, it might be there, it might not be there, so how do I deal with that? Well, let's look at version 2 here. So in version 2 of our application, we have a higher order component that is called my component, and that's always going to be there. So let's open my component and look at the index.js file here. So we follow the same pattern here. We have a component that is instantiated to null, and if the language is Swedish, we require the Swedish version, and otherwise it's going to be the English version. So we can always trust that this my component, it's always going to be there. Okay, so that's good enough. So let's look at the Swedish version of this component. So the Swedish version only has the header without the subheading, as expected in this this first version. So this version only has the header, but in the English version we have the header and the subheading. So now we have kind of mitigated a little bit of this issue where sometimes the component is going to be there, sometimes it's not going to be there, and we can kind of avoid that entire scenario where a component might be there, it might not be there. We simply load different versions of the same component that is going to include different things. So what I want you to take away from this is that this approach here allows you to kind of extract and include things that is going to be in just one version of the application, or in all of them, and sometimes it's going to be a little bit different for one version of the application. So to summarize this little approach of mine, by doing this you can add custom components or copy paste and maintain multiple versions of the same component, because remember, maybe you have like a really complicated big page or a route or something like that, right? And maybe you because there's nothing stopping you. The beauty about this is that you could start adding this to your project today. You could take an entire existing React application. You could let's say that you have an entire page where for one customer the page is going to look one way, and for another customer it's going to look a different way. There's no cost to you to just copy paste multiple versions and simply including them using this index.js approach, because you're never going to include it into the bundle that you are creating for that customer. That's what's so powerful about this. You can basically copy paste entire components, and the only cost, as far as I can see, to your project is that you have to maintain multiple versions. So let's say that you're changing something that is common for all of these different variations of that component. Well, then you're going to have to update all of those components, and maybe you want to refactor that and make it a little bit nicer. But at the very least, you have now a very clean way to create multiple versions of a page or functionality or a component, and create these different variations for each customer without sending more code to that customer than needed, basically. So all of this is possible without, basically, yeah, I kind of summarized what I was just saying here. And to once again mention this, this is not production tested code, but it is code that I've created this idea. If I'm being completely honest with you, my company is right now looking into how to use this sort of functionality for a use case in basically live. And this little video that I'm making here, this code that you're seeing now, I've already made a business case of this, and I presented it to my own stakeholders at my company, and they were very positive to this approach. And it's very likely that this is something that's going to go into production at our company fairly soon. So basically, it's just me sharing some ideas that I have kind of put together from working in different environments where I've had to deal with this sort of issue. And what I can tell you is that this approach it has worked very well for me in the past. And I'm very excited about testing out this exact implementation of this approach in a more serious manner and see how it goes. And hopefully me sharing this with you has taught you some things and maybe given you some ideas about how you can implement this sort of thing yourself. And yeah, that's basically it. I hope you have a great day.